And if you talk to industry experts in the deep sea mining space, they're telling me that China is, let's say, 2 or 3 years behind, so running behind TMC and others. But I think they could also close that gap quite quickly if they want to. I'm not sure whether deep sea mining on the upstream side is a huge priority for China because of their current terrestrial mining, terrestrial upstream dominance as well. And of course, you alluded to this, they've got the processing, they control the processing stage quite significantly, looking at a couple of supply chains like graphite, rare earths, but also cobalt, copper to some extent, although copper is more diversified. Yeah, nickel through Indonesia. So I'm not sure whether there's such a rush to control also the upstream and the mining side on the deep sea mining side as well.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast. I'm Eric Young. Joining me today is lead policy and geopolitical analyst at Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, Bryan Bille. Bryan focuses on how government policy and geopolitics shape mineral supply chains. Bryan, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Eric, for having me. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, so I'm excited to get what I think of as an impartial take on the broader dynamics that kind of impact the mineral supply chains and how that affects the deep sea mining nascent industry. I think I've had a number of people on this podcast kind of arguing for different dynamics, different forces pushing the mineral supply chain this way and that way. But they've always been one foot in the industry one way or another. Whether kind of investing or promoting or opposing. And so give us, I guess, a little bit of background on who you are, Benchmark Minerals Intelligence, and how you approach the industry.
Yeah, happy to start with the intro. So Benchmark Mineral Intelligence is you can call us a market and a geoeconomic intelligence provider or a research consultancy. And our USP is the coverage of the mine to electric vehicle supply chain. So we try to map out and assess not only the market, but also the geoeconomic development on the critical minerals, battery, and electric vehicle supply chain. So from mine to electric vehicle, so from the minerals to the actual EV. It's a company that was established more than 10 years ago. We started with doing price assessments, so assessing the prices and the fluctuation of the price of the minerals. And I think we've grown into a company having that holistic view on the battery and EV supply chain. I'm sitting on the geoeconomic and policy front side. So my job is to not only speak to policymakers and shapers, but also to integrate let's say geoeconomic or an assessment of the geoeconomic and policy developments into our wider analysis, basically combining that with the market analysis that we provide. And yeah, the link to deep sea mining. So we have, you can consider us a bit of as an external viewer of this. So we're not really part of the, let's say, of the ecosystem, let's say the NGOs, the law firms, the actual developers. We try to provide a more market and geoeconomic view of deep sea mining, placing it or trying to see where it could fit into the current and future market and geoeconomic context relating to critical minerals. So looking at what is driving demand for minerals. I mean, we focus a lot on batteries and EVs. I mean, as I said, we start also to look at defense and other demand drivers, but that's our role in this. So as you said, we don't advocate for or against deep sea mining, just we're trying to have that fact-based and impartial view on where this industry, nascent industry, could fit into the current critical mineral market and the future market as well.
Yeah, so you guys, I mean, you sell information, and so the value of that information is the information is the product, and what people are paying for is the accuracy of that information. So you want to be as accurate as possible. It doesn't do you any good to slant things in anybody's favor because people are paying you to understand the real dynamics.
Absolutely.
I start here just because I think deep sea mining is a controversial, sort of polarized topic. And one of the things that I'm realizing I'm trying to do with this podcast is take the topics and the aspects that are the most controversial and then try to bring different perspectives and bring more context to that. And so that I'm hoping we're going to do that with some of the things that people tend to disagree on, argue about in the deep sea mining context.
One thing that we always acknowledge in the presentations and basically the content that we provide on deep sea mining is the enormous resource potential of deep sea mining, especially on the nodule side. So the nodules, the polymetallic nodules to be found, especially in the CCZ. If you look at the resource potential, I mean, the numbers are gigantic. We're talking about between 15 and 25 billion, potentially billion tons of nodules that can be harvested. So that's, in terms of, looking at the grades, I mean, looking at what's inside these polymetallic nodules, we talk about mainly nickel, copper, manganese, and cobalt, especially cobalt, copper, and nickel. Looking at the grades, they're much higher than the grades of those minerals found on the ground in the terrestrial mining sector. So that's something I think we need to keep in mind. So I think putting those numbers and link to the resource potential, I think that's a key message that we always try to convey.
So you just got back from your first attendance at the International Seabed Authority meeting. I guess let's start there. So what was your message that you brought to the ISA, and what was your perception? What was your kind of takeaway from that meeting?
That's a really good question, because there's again something that drives our analysis further. Those trips, I mean, those are extremely valuable. Yeah, we acknowledge the resource potential. I think something that struck me a lot, but perhaps not so surprising to you, is that the discussion and the narrative and the people being there are mainly looking at the legal and governance sides of the issue. I mean, talking about the International Mining Code, the potential litigation issues because of what's happening in the US. On the other hand, you've got the NGO community, which is very present there, advocating for, looking at the environmental impact potentially of deep sea mining. But the market and the geoeconomic issue, or the geoeconomic angle, is largely missing in my view. Of course, you've got the project developers being there, the future industry that are following the negotiations very closely. But whether this makes sense economically, financially, and whether this new and future supply could be absorbed by the current market and the future market, and the geoeconomic aspects as well, as of what's happening in the US, what China is doing, what Europe stands on deep sea mining, because that's also an interesting one. In my view, that was largely missing. But of course, that's a personal view. I mean, that's just an impression that I had. That's my perception. But that would be my main takeaway. I mean, and it's quite illustrative that we had a discussion with the Secretary General and her staff of the ISA, and she was, to some extent, quite surprised about my presentation and the insight. So I think there's a lot of room there still to be filled with this type of analysis. Yeah,
that's kind of fascinating. And I mean, my initial response to that is, isn't it appropriate that the ISA, as a regulator who regulates and has an overview, to develop the legal side and to protect the environmental side? Isn't that natural that would be their focus? And is it kind of make the case that they should have more of the geopolitical and policy broader aspects present at that meeting?
I mean, I'm not saying that the ISA doesn't have that. I mean, the ISA is well aware of what's happening in the US. I mean, they're well aware of the risk of being insignificant is perhaps too harsh, but there is a risk of losing a lot of significance if TMC is getting that permit in 2027 in Q1. I mean, the community there is not enough aware of the, let's say, the geoeconomic dynamics playing in the critical minerals world, because they're so focused on deep sea mining. That's the first element. And the second one, yes, of course, the ISA is a regulator, but parts of the regulation touches upon the economics, the financials, and in the end also the market side of deep sea mining. Think about the royalties, think about the potential compensation mechanism to current big producers of minerals. Think about Chile, think about the DRC, think about Indonesia. So I think, again, I'm not saying that the ISA is not including that into the discussions or as a facilitator, facilitating this, but my sense was that there is a much more room to address those issues.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I feel like previous guests have suggested that those are the topics that furthest behind on. So they're getting there with environmental regulations and in the mining code development, but then things like benefit sharing are very much being kicked down the road. So interesting that you say that there's not enough kind of participation in the meetings to further that along.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's extremely challenging, right? Because in the end, it's about comparing terrestrial mining to deep sea mining, which is very hard. And also looking at the compensation mechanism. I mean, I can imagine I'm not an expert in those legal discussions and negotiations, but I can imagine those discussions are very hard and goes, I think, to the crux of the issue. Because, for instance, a producer like Chile, I mean, they are backing a moratorium for environmental reasons. I think that's the official explanation. But at the same time, I mean, I think they're well aware of the risk of additional supply coming onto the market, and also at risk of losing market share, especially on the copper side. So I think those issues are playing on the background, but technically I think there is room still for improvement. But at the same time, those discussions are so challenging and take a lot of time.
That's interesting. I was going to get to that later, but I guess maybe let's just jump right there, because that is one of the key messages, the key argument points in the deep sea mining discussion is this better or worse than onshore mining in its various formats? And along with that, what effect will this have on onshore mining? And people like to argue over whether it will be whether it will replace impactful onshore mining or whether it will just add to that. So yeah, can you weigh in on that? Kind of add some more detail to that conversation instead of just kind of will it, won't it. Which aspects do you think people should pay attention to in terms of how it will impact onshore mining?
Yes, I mean, that's a very, very challenging question. It all, I think, depends on the market and the mineral itself. I mean, the one that is used the most, I think, is nickel. Looking at our forecast, and I mean the special issue that we issued on deep sea mining, so a publication, we looked at the potential supply deficits emerging in the next couple of years. For nickel, there will be a supply deficit, looking at demand, supply, looking at demand from batteries, demand from steel, and we factored in additional potential polymetallic nodule supply, and in that publication, we assessed and we concluded that there is room for additional nickel supply to be absorbed in the future market. So that would tell us that in the case of nickel, potentially deep sea mining supply could be added, it could exist along existing supply. Again, that's just an estimation, that's just an indication, it's not a fact. And at the same time, there will also be price dynamics playing. I mean, if there is additional supply of nickel, that will have also an impact on the pricing of nickel, and in turn have an impact on the actual suppliers, the producer of nickels currently, and in this case, Indonesia. So I think for nickel, you could say that it could exist along existing supply. It will not replace or displace a part of the supply, but...
So what you're sort of saying is that one of the factors is demand gap. Is it projected that we're going to have enough production in the future to cover the expected demand, and in contexts where we're going to really fall short of that, where the number of mines that are currently under development, when you compare it to the amount of mineral that we expect to need in the various sectors, where there's a big gap, then the addition of a new source, in this case deep sea nodules, isn't going to necessarily shut down existing mines. It's more likely to run alongside because there's enough demand pull for both kind of options to exist simultaneously.
Yeah, that's the theory. So it's very theoretical. On the ground, other things could happen. I mean, we could talk more about processing. We could talk more about, actual currently potential new nickel mines being under development, but being delayed. So that forecast could then change in that regard. We provide forecast every quarter, but those forecasts could change. The only thing that we provided in the special issue is we identified, based on our current forecast, a deficit between demand and supply of nickel in a couple of years, and that could be absorbed by potential nodule supply. But I would like to come back to your earlier question, because I think you also asked about the trade-offs and being deep sea mining worse or better than terrestrial mining and terrestrial mine supply. I mean, again, that's it's quite simplistic to have that kind of conclusion, to convey that conclusion, because it's a very challenging, a very technical issue. The only thing that we provided a life cycle assessment for the metals company. So we use a couple of environmental conditions, like global warming, water consumption. And I think from that, we concluded very cautiously that, and we benchmarked nodule supply from their resource or NORI-D against terrestrial mining. I think in that case it was nickel supply, because it was for my time, so I need to be careful. It was nickel supply from Indonesia, and I think copper and cobalt production in DRC. And I think for those 7 conditions we concluded, and especially for global warming, we concluded that deep sea mines output is more environmental friendly than those outputs. But again, it's a very partial, just a fraction of the assessment, I think, in the end, because the social aspects was not covered, biodiversity either. My point is I think it's very difficult to make a holistic assessment of whether potential additional nodule of deep sea mining more in general is more polluting than terrestrial mining. It really depends on like every study, I think, on the matrix and the conditions you use, I think.
Yeah, and it especially depends on which impact categories you're looking at. Exactly what you said. If you look at global warming potential, that's one thing. If you look at land use change or biodiversity impact, then it tends to come out another way. And the emphasis that people put on their favorite category tends to kind of align with what their preferred outcome. I think this is definitely one of the aspects of all environmental challenges, but deep sea mining is a really good test case for this. Is how do we reconcile looking at all of the different categories of value and all of the different important things that we need to take into consideration in making a decision. So I think it's interesting, especially from where you sit, where you're in benchmark, where you guys do very quantitative analysis of things like price and actual mine supply. Like you've got I guess some of the hardest numbers on whether or not we're going to meet some of these demand values. And I guess you also produce some of those demand figures. But then your job is to look at the broader political and market forces that are going to push all of this around. So interesting to hear how you advise people to weigh all of these different factors when you're in a room with people and they're asking you for your expertise, and you know that there's 7 different factors that they ought to be pulling in to make a decision that's laid in trade-offs. Like, how do you navigate that? I know that's a vague question, but it's one of the most central questions here.
That's a difficult question. Also depends on your audience and who is asking this, right? I mean, if it's an OEM, for instance, maybe we talked about demand, just basically the actors buying the potential supply in the minerals. I mean, OEMs, they need to factor a lot of things in, I think, especially the European OEMs. They're currently a lot under pressure. There's a lot of competition from China. They need the minerals, but they also need to pay a price tag for that. There is now an increasing narrative. I mean, before it was a green premium. So basically the idea of paying more for the minerals that are mined in a more environmentally friendly way. That has shifted, I mean, also because of the geopolitics, to a security premium or resilience premiums, basically the willingness to pay more for supply coming from, let's put it bluntly, from ex-China sources, so from diversified supply. But that again, that comes with a price. So I think something we haven't seen yet, and that comes down to the trade-off, is that especially the European OEMs, I mean, again, it's quite, we overgeneralize things. I think a minority is willing to pay a bit more for those diversified sources, and potentially, those sources that are mined in a more environmentally friendly way, because sometimes they collide, sometimes not. But still the majority, and especially on the OEM side, and especially in Europe, the majority is not yet willing to pay more for that supply for ex-China, potentially also green premium. So I think that comes down to, for those companies, that they need to factor in so many things. And in the end, the price, I think, especially for companies under pressure and with a lot of competition from China, comes down to paying the price and to stay competitive. So I think that example gives you, I think, some sense of the trade-offs that need to be addressed. At the same time, if you speak to a government, especially the US, I mean, the US is very active now in the critical mineral space. They made a lot of investments. A lot of them are conditional, but still, they're moving forward. There, the supply resilience angle is much stronger. It's about creating those ex-China sources, creating that diversified supply as soon as possible. Of course, that will take time. But there, for that actor, supply resilience is much more important. So I think in the end, it depends on who the actor is and who what the priorities are, basically.
Did I see that Benchmark had a green nickel price instrument for a little while? Do you guys still do that?
Not actively anymore, I think. It was, as I said, it was a lively debate, I think 2 years ago. I think also driven by the European Union, European Commission, so the executive body in Europe. They were quite keen to drive this discussion, also to look at, okay, how can we support companies, or how can we drive companies to pay more for that green or greener supply. Now it's more like a security premium, but as I said, sometimes the supply collides because it comes from the same source. It's a bit more costly. It's ex-China, and it happens to be then greener, but it can also be different. But the issue there is that the regulator there wanted to push those companies to pay more. They're trying to do that through regulation, but still, I think the label green nickel is not as widely used anymore as 2 years ago.
It's one of those kind of case studies of how the conversation has moved on from energy transition to energy security, and then just to security and the need to have supplies for defense markets and things. I wonder how you see that from where you're sitting. Is that a big difference in the market, or like does that shift in narrative actually push the market in different places, or is it a shift in narrative but really the companies are still making the same decisions, and at the end of the day it's the same buyers and sellers operating off of the same kind of price drivers, and the narrative has just flowed around the reality?
In my view, it's largely a narrative issue. Although, of course, we have seen dynamic changes. I think the best example is batteries. I mean, batteries and especially energy storage can be linked to the energy transition, but also now increasingly linked to defense and to AI. So, and that has translated into more demand for energy storage batteries, especially in the US and also in Asia. But in the end, these batteries are also used for the energy transition and for the electrification. Same for copper. I mean, copper is increasingly linked to AI, to data centers. But in the end, you need also copper a lot for the electrical infrastructure. So the narrative has changed. Some demand dynamics as well that will have effects and consequences for supply as well. But batteries are also used for energy transition, so the narrative has changed. But in the end, it's more or less the same supply or demand to some extent. But in my discussion, of course, that's translated differently. I mean, if you start, we worked a lot together as a company with the Biden administration. The discussion was centered on energy transition. I mean, also looking at the policy narratives, the communication, the output. Now talking to the Trump administration, because those are clients of us and several government entities. There, it's all about just security, defense, and I think that's something that is good from this shift in narrative as well. Is what's happening now in the US. Before, it was heavily focused. If you're talking about critical minerals and critical technologies, it was heavily focused on building a mine to magnet supply chain. So investing in rare earths, investing in magnet supply. Now you can see also with the recent announcements last week from the Trump administration, it's starting to shifting a bit more again to building that mine to battery supply chain as well, and especially the next gen battery technologies, because that's an area where a country but also an actor could still make a difference and could not leapfrog China, because I think that's not possible, to be very frank, but decrease that gap with China a bit more than with the current technologies, I think.
And so, say a little bit more about why these next-gen batteries are of interest right now. For a while, the shift in battery discussion was, we're moving away from the really high energy density cathodes, NMCs, towards LFPs, because we've realized that we can get by with cars that have a little bit less range. And then is it now talk about drone technology? And you mentioned AI. Does AI have a tie into batteries? Like, what's driving the shift to different battery technologies?
Yes. So, going back to my point about energy storage and increase of demand for that has been translated a lot in the US of a shift of factories on the ground. It's a bit more complicated, but from a high level perspective, that's translated into especially Asian producers cooperating with the US producers in shifting from making EV batteries to energy storage batteries. And that comes down to making LFP batteries, because LFP batteries are used for energy storage. So that's a big shift. And of course, I mean, before we said, okay, LFP batteries, they've got for EVs, then they've got a very low range compared to NMC batteries or high nickel batteries. That's still the case, but that gap has decreased a little bit. So we see a bigger deployment of LFP batteries in EVs, especially in the Asian market. In the US as well, much less in Europe. I mean, Europe is increasing its LFP production, but slowlier than the others, and also with a lot of Chinese and Asian involvement. But in the end, what we see is, okay, the market share of LFP has increased a lot. I think it's around 60% now, or a bit less. But NMC will still grow a lot and will still remain significant as a demand driver, especially in the markets like Europe. Looking at next gen, that's a bit more challenging. I mean, we see that obviously the emergence of sodium ion and solid state, but sodium ion now is largely a Chinese story. I mean, China is very advanced on this. Looking at 2030, I think the estimated or the forecasted market share there is, well above 95%. There is obviously an opportunity for non-Chinese producers, but there is already, I mean, they're already running behind, I'd say. For solid states, it's a bit more difficult, I would say, to assess that. But those two are especially the next gen battery technologies that we focus a lot on currently.
Okay, so I should try to tie this back into the conversations that I hear in the deep sea mining debate. And one of these is that we're shifting away from NMC batteries. Yeah, simplistically put, there's a shift away from nickel-based batteries, and so we no longer need the nickel from the Clarion-Clipperton zone. That's one of the things that you would hear. I think that you're well placed to put the numbers to that.
Yes, I think that's partly true. If you're looking at nickel and especially manganese, I mean, the biggest demand driver are not batteries, it's the steel market. And for manganese, I think it's quite telling. I mean, batteries, I think it's less than 10%, even less than 5%. I think it's even 2%, looking at manganese sulfate. So the steel market is the biggest demand driver there. So I think knowing this should be nuanced. And the second one, same for nickel. I mean, the steel market is still the biggest demand driver. And looking at what Indonesia now is producing, it's still largely going to the steel market. It's largely going to China as well. So I would be careful. I mean, although of course we have conveyed that message as well at our conferences, during our presentations. I mean, also to TMC, for instance, and they told us, I think rightly, that there are a lot more demand drivers for those metals in those minerals in those nodules. So I think it's true, and at the same time you need to nuance this, looking at the steel market, but also other demand drivers. I mean, we focus a lot on batteries and EVs. We now increasingly looking more at defense, and defense is also a demand driver. It's much lower one, but still. So focusing on batteries and EVs makes sense, energy transition, but of course, tying also to the discussion we had about security, I think we need to have a bigger picture as well to nuance this claim, I think. Yeah.
So even if the battery discussion does shift away from nickel, that's actually not the biggest driver of the nickel market, is to put that simply. And so it's not a magic bullet in terms of that argument about whether or not we need the nodules.
Yeah, and also, I mean, looking at battery technologies itself, I mean, we discussed this. NMC, high nickel batteries, will still remain important despite the growth of LFP. And also, don't forget the geopolitical angle. Western and non-Chinese markets, actors, governments need to embrace LFPs, also politically, because that makes EVs cheaper. So the adoption rates can go higher. At the same time, the geopolitics are playing as well. I mean, it's the Chinese technologies. There is the huge push to diversify away from China. So I think balancing those two also, I think, results in the fact that especially Europe will still embrace NMC batteries.
Yeah, the other narrative that is floating around a lot that people have differing opinions on is to what extent it is appropriate to take an adversarial posture towards China. So much of this discussion is kind of the West versus China. China's winning the battery race that is being imported indirectly and also directly into the deep sea mining question. Is China going to win the deep sea mining race, or is some of the deep sea mining play going to bring more countries into China's kind of circle? And then, yeah, not to mention the whole secondary question of once we get the minerals up out of the ground, should they be sent to China? Does it just recreate the same problem? Are we solving anything if there's no processing in the West? So, yeah, start with kind of how you see the whole framing, the conflict-based framing. Is that appropriate? Is that smart? Working to add nuance to that. And then maybe we'll talk about processing after.
Is it smart? I mean, that's quite a difficult one for me to answer. Linking back, for instance, the difference between the how Europe is looking at China, and again, difficult because if you talk about Europe, if you talk about the European Union, it's a group of 27 member countries, but trying to group that thinking, the European thinking is quite different from the US thinking. I mean, Europe is looking at China as a systemic rival, but at the same time wants to keep cooperation going, wants to keep the lines open, is still embracing Chinese investments in Europe, although there are now in the direction of adopting a more stringent approach in terms of foreign direct investments, attaching requirements in terms of value addition, the sharing of IP and so forth. So I think in the end, Europe will still embrace, I think, Chinese cooperation, but with conditions. And that's going into that direction. Even a country as Germany, who has always embraced China, has a lot of export links with China, has a lot of investments in China, is going into that direction. While in the US, I mean, it's much more hawkish. Although with the Trump administration right now, it's a bit difficult to make sense of what's happening because it's very hawkish. I mean, it's been translated into a lot of regulation and a lot of anti-China sourcing rules driving those domestic supply chains. But at the same time, at the geopolitical level, at the political level, I mean, especially at the highest presidential level, there is an admiration for China. There is an admiration for Xi Jinping as a leader. But looking at investments and the industries we cover, I think it's fair to say that Europe is more open to China than the US. And I think the European stance makes sense because of China's position and dominance right now in the supply chain. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't diversify away from China. I think you should. It's always good to diversify from one dominant player and have different sources. But if you need the technology, if you can learn from someone else with the right conditions, I think it's the right way to go. There is a question, of course, whether that other player, in this case China, will accept those conditions as well and also sharing that technology. I mean, that's a bit more difficult, I think, at this stage to assess. And then your question about China in the deep sea mining space, sorry, for me it's a difficult one to assess. Why? Because I mean, there is some information about the companies and the authorities holding those exploration contracts. There is some information about the testing as well. I mean, if you talk to experts, industry experts in the deep sea mining space, they're telling me that China is, let's say, 2 or 3 years behind, so running behind TMC and others. But I think they could also close that gap quite quickly if they want to. That's my take. I'm not sure whether deep sea mining on the upstream side is a huge priority for China because of their current terrestrial mining or their current terrestrial upstream dominance as well. And of course, you alluded to this, they control the processing stage quite significantly, looking at a couple of supply chains like graphite, rare earths, but also cobalt, copper to some extent, although copper is more diversified, but nickel through Indonesia. So I'm not sure whether there's such a rush to control also the upstream and the mining side on the deep sea mining side as well. But that's just my guess.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at it is that China is lagging, but on the one hand, I think you're right. China has proven in other sectors they've got the ability to make up ground incredibly quickly. When they kind of throw their weight behind an industry, they can leapfrog pretty rapidly. And very interesting that what you say that they don't have that insecurity of mineral supply driving them to really throw their weight into deep sea mining. So they're staying in it. They're kind of running pack, and if it becomes a problem, then they've got maybe the ability to really.
Yeah, they've got the numbers with them. I mean, they've got the money, they can subsidize those players, and they've got the capabilities as well in terms of engineering, I think. On the second hand, that comes down to the lack of information in the numbers as well. I mean, you had a fascinating episode, I think, on your pod about the Chinese vessels. I mean, and that investigation that's unpacked and unveiled that a lot of these vessels are circulating in foreign waters as well. Mm-hmm. I think it's just an example of the lack of information that we have on this, and that we're still underestimating China in this debate. But at the same time, my guess is that although China now is seen as a front runner in terms of the of pushing for the mining code within the ISA, and also the multilateral angle is pretty important because geopolitically China tries to portray itself as we are still believing in multilateralism. Although, however, even with current Trump administration on mining this, but I think on the ground, are they in such a rush? I don't know, because they're already dominating the upstream part so much. I think they want to try to be deeply involved in this debate too, also to have a stake and to see what happens. But yeah, I don't know. But again, there is such a lack of information on what China is doing in deep sea mining, I think, and that's just a fascinating issue. I think there is a lot of room to unpack what's happening there.
And then the other side of that is that the West, if we use that language, does really want to try to leapfrog. There is concern of not having supply chain security, especially in the processing phase. And so this is one of the things that gets discussed in the deep sea mining conversation is deep sea mining is a mining focused industry. Is it going to be able to address that secondary processing bottleneck at all? Like right now, a lot of the discussion is, okay, we'll get these nodules up, we'll take them to existing processing facilities on a tolling basis, and then eventually kind of build out. But how do you see that bottleneck and the potential for deep sea mining to, solve that aspect of the supply chain?
Yeah, I think it is a bottleneck. I mean, also for terrestrial mining, for critical minerals more in general, because it has shifted now over the past, I think, 1 or 2 years. I mean, before critical minerals was, I think, when it became hot a couple of years ago, I think it was still looked a lot through the lens of mining. Then it shifted a little bit. Now it's much more about, okay, we need to build our processing capabilities as well because of that Chinese dominance. And that is also, I think, translated into the deep sea mining discussion. I think in terms of, is it possible? I think it's possible. I mean, TMC to some extent has already shown that it is possible. I mean, they claim to have been able to process those nodules at a very low commercial scale into the alloys and then the manganese silicates. But it's a question of building that processing capability to being able to a level of being able to process 3 million tons of those nodules. And then in the end, if we believe the numbers of TMC, is to process 12 million tons of these nodules. That's a gigantic number. So I think also looking at the technology they want to use, RKF technology that already exists is being used in Indonesia. PAMCO is also using that, the potential partner of TMC. So I think in terms of technology, it is possible, but I think it's just a question of building that competitive ecosystem of processing. The timing issue as well. I mean, if you want to build a processing facility, in terms of timing, it's much less than, it takes a lot less time than I'm building a mine, for instance, but still you need to build it. And I think it will take some years. I mean, looking at what TMC wants to do in the US, it will take some years. So there's the timing issue. And in the end, I mean, as we also, I think conveyed, and also derived as a key takeaway in our deep sea mining publication, a special issue, there's a big question of what will TMC, but also others do with the manganese. I mean, if you process the manganese into manganese silicate, you will need to sell that. I mean, the manganese market is primarily a steel market, and the steel market grows quite slowly every year, and it's a very locked in market. I mean, looking at manganese, it's South Africa, China mainly. You've got a couple of other producers outside of those countries, but it's quite difficult to get in that market. I mean, just imagine the amount of manganese that comes additionally onto the market from deep sea mining. It will be huge. And we're not looking at the supply deficit there, so it will be very difficult to absorb that. So it will be key for TMC, but also for others to sell that manganese at a competitive price as well, to be able to develop that, not only the project, but also that ecosystem of processing in a competitive way.
Yeah, and that's why I think when anyone is evaluating kind of an economic forecast relating to deep sea mining, it's always really important to look at what they're planning to do with the manganese. I know different forecasts will kind of say make different scenarios with different manganese assumptions, because that is such a big aspect of that. I guess before I let you go, just on that topic of processing, I think the kind of the most interesting takeaway for me from this conversation is when you were talking about the trade-offs and how we bring different value categories into decision making. I think I heard you say kind of like some of those value categories naturally get reflected in the price. And so the price, like we sometimes will cynically say, none of it matters. It's just the price. That's what everybody decides on at the end of the day. But then you look a little bit more nuanced. Some factors get taken into the price naturally, and then some factors we try really hard to kind of force them into the price. And this is where some of the regulatory, I guess, levers get pulled to try to make different things we care about, such as security and friendshoring, just be reflected in the prices. And I guess that this, at the end of the day, is going to be part of the answer to the question about the processing issue also. Is like, it's one thing to say that, okay, we can make RKEF refineries, but if we can't make them produce cheaper than China, then at the end of the day, is anyone going to buy it? Do you have final thoughts on how the West competes on the price side?
Yes, I think it's quite hard. I mean, looking again at how the West can compete against China in the critical minerals market. I mean, it depends on the mineral itself again, but just globally, I think, why have we seen an emergence of government intervention in those markets? Not only investments like equity investments in projects, but also price intervention. I mean, those price floors being deployed in the US. I think it's because of a lot of these markets, without any government intervention, it will be very difficult, not say impossible, to compete with China. I mean, we've seen this, or we're perhaps going to see this in the deep sea mining space as well. I mean, the facility that TMC's talked about developing in the United States, in the port of Brownsville in Texas. I mean, without any US government intervention or without any US government investment, it will be quite challenging and quite hard, I think, to develop that. I mean, I don't have the numbers, but my guess is that they expect a government intervention on this. So I think my take is price matters. And if you want to be competitive, let's say on different fronts, not only processing, but just looking at offtakes as well, because in the end, you will need to sell the supply and you will need to find a buyer for this. If the price is too high, I mean, so something needs to happen, I think. And has already happened in many markets, in the rare earth market and so forth. There needs to be a price floor, price intervention from the government.
Yeah, kind of fascinating how the free market dynamics, which people identify the Western side of this question, are in some ways shooting us in the foot. And so interesting how that's going to be dealt with.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating because if you speak to a lot of experts about just the government intervening in the market, I mean, it's quite fascinating because it's quite new. I mean, industrial policy emerged, let's say, after COVID, because then, all the supply resilience stuff came about. So I think it's pretty new, but still in this market, I mean, it's quite fascinating to see the government intervening in those markets. Again, it needs to be measured because obviously too much intervention is also bad for the market. It will have some negative consequences, but in some parts it is needed.
Okay, Bryan, I know you've got to run to another meeting here. Anything else you want to note on before we wrap up? And where do you send people to follow you and to get more information on these things? Where can people follow what Benchmark is up to?
I mean, I'm happy to share the link to the special issue, the publication we published on deep sea mining. And I think I would say follow us on LinkedIn. I mean, a lot is happening in the industries that we cover, so we try to provide a lot of updates on this on LinkedIn.
Great. I'll put links to that special issue in the show notes and to your LinkedIn. Okay, Bryan, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you so much, Eric. It was a pleasure.